The Weimar Republic was born in defeat, and no serious account of its literature can ignore that for long. The Republic didn't arrive after a neat transition from one form of government to another, one stable order to the next. It came out of catastrophic military collapse, mass death, hunger, revolution, and desperate wounded pride. A population that had not even remotely agreed what the catastrophe meant and how to face it. That's why so much of the writing of the Weimar era feels bruised. Even when the subject isn't about the war in the trenches directly, the war is there in the background, alters people's voices, their confidence, their politics, their whole expectations of each other and of society. For some writers, the war was a wound, a weeping horror. For others, it was an ordeal, an experience that could be savoured. For others still, it was a broken inheritance, the shattering of a line. But for almost nobody was it over. That's the world of our second group of authors. If we start with Eric Maria Remarque, because he's in some ways the clearest and most globally recognised voice of this damage. All Quiet on the Western Front did something almost unforgivable in the eyes of the German nationalists. It stripped war of style and of purpose. There was no heroism, there was no noble destiny, there was no great meaning to it. What Remarque gives you instead is mud, fear, boredom, mutilation, the slow destruction of young men before they've had time to become fully adult. That really mattered in Weimar Germany because the Republic was full of such young men. They'd come home carrying not simply memories and scars, but altered nervous systems. They no longer fitted into the old language of honour and service, nor did they fit easily into civilian life. Remarque's later book, The Road Back, makes this even clearer. The war's over, but it hasn't released its grip. Return itself becomes a problem. And that's one of the central truths of the Republic. Demobilization was military long before it was emotional. In contrast, there's Ernst Jünger. He stands in hard and revealing opposition to Remarque. Jünger doesn't sentimentalize war either, but he doesn't write it primarily as ruin. In Storm of Steel, his semi-autobiographical memoir, he writes battle as ordeal and intensity, a testing ground for tempering oneself like steel in a furnace. It's the place where manhood is made. The book is brilliant, undeniably, but deeply disquieting because you can feel in it this fascination with toughness, hardness that belongs very deeply to a certain portion of post-war German society that would go on to forge this feeling of necessity for toughness and would welcome in the Nazis. The contrast between Remarque and Jünger, it isn't just some literary curiosity. It tells you something really vital about Weimar society. Defeat didn't produce one response or reaction. It produced a struggle for meaning. People wanted to understand what the war meant. Why did it happen? How should they respond to it? And here are two fundamentally different responses. One man came home appalled by what war had done to human beings, to him. Another came home convinced that war had revealed the emptiness of bourgeois softness and the need to toughen society and the people within it. These are not merely two writers, they're two moral and political possibilities that existed inside Germany in 1918. And much of Weimar lived in that gap between them. The third author is Arnold Zweig, and he takes us to yet another aspect of the same catastrophe. In the case of Sergeant Grisha, the horror lies not only in the violence, but in the machinery that administrates it. Bureaucracy, command and procedure, all the paperwork of war and the obedience without thought that went with it, particularly in Prussia and subsequently Germany, all those dead forms of authority. That's particularly modern insight and a very Weimar one. It suggested that the barbarism doesn't always scream in with a shell. Sometimes it just stamps a file. And we can see this echoed later in the ghastly administrative process that led to the Holocaust. What Zweig understood in his writing was that war had exposed more than cruelty. It had exposed systems. Men could be destroyed not just by shells, but by the institutions carrying on with procedural seriousness when lives were being destroyed. The Republic had inherited those institutions. And that's one reason his work belongs so strongly in this section. Then there's Stefan Zweig, who broadens the field out of Germany proper into Austria. He was Austrian, he lived in Vienna, but he gave the whole period its elegiac note. In him, you can see what the war did to the confidence of the educated liberal world, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, in these places where empires had fallen. A civilization that had thought itself humane, cultured, rational, and secure suddenly had to confront the fact that the foundations had been far more fragile than they'd ever imagined. In The World of Yesterday, written later but looking back on the period, that loss becomes almost unbearable in retrospect. Stefan Zweig reminds us that Weimar and the other societies in that area of Europe, this wasn't just a national crisis, it was just one episode in a civilizational collapse of confidence. The old order didn't die and leave a stable successor, it died and left a vacuum. One can almost feel that vacancy in almost all the literature of the period, even when it's not named directly. The expectation that something needs to come back and reassert order. Hans Fallada brings this broad historical damage down to an ordinary scale. He's invaluable for that. In Little Man, What Now? War isn't relived in the trenches. It's lived in the social aftermath, insecurity, fear of unemployment, shrinking prospects, a society in which private decency is being worn down by economic pressure. Fallada shows what large historical failures feel like inside small domestic spaces. The republic of deficits, anxieties, and thinning margins. The republic in which a young couple's future can be broken not by ideology, at least not at first, but by a steady grind of everyday conditions. And that too is a legacy of the war, not just memory, but prolonged instability. Defeat doesn't stop working on a society when an armistice is signed. It works on salaries and housing and marriages and economic confidence, all aspects of the social experience. And Fallada writes that long aftermath with an extraordinary honesty and a remarkable clarity for us today in a society where our inflation is driving prices up and salaries aren't keeping pace. He is particularly relevant. Irmgard Keun belongs partly in our third category as well. She's indispensable here because she writes what postmodern modernity felt like for women, coming into adulthood in the wake of the war. There's no point talking about a broken generation as though it was just male. They had been the ones who had gone to fight, but women had had a transformational experience during the war as well, whether it's as workers or being left responsible for the household and home. And women in Weimar inherited a world, a city in Berlin and Hamburg and Frankfurt and so on, transformed by war and defeat too. They moved differently, they worked differently, particularly in the cities, and faced a modern social world whose promises and humiliations were often inseparable. In The Artificial Silk Girl and Gilgi, Keun gives us young women trying to build set themselves in a society where old certainties have cracked and money is always close enough to power to distort relationships. The war isn't always named on every page, but the conditions it helped to create are everywhere. Unstable class positions, accelerated all changes in the gender dynamic, urban performance, emotional precariousness. That's part of the broken generation too. And then there is Leon Feuchtwanger, who belongs here because he understood how defeat and dislocation opened the way for political monstrosity. In Success and elsewhere, he writes reaction, provincial resentment, vanity, and corruption, and the rise of dark political energies with an extraordinary sharpness. He's one of those writers who saw that collapse doesn't remain merely psychological, it becomes organizational. It finds parties and slogans and uniforms and resentments to flatter, enemies to identify. And that is the final and most dangerous phase of this story. The war didn't only produce grief, it also produced hardness, myth, self pity, and a longing for restoration. Some writers fought those tendencies, some embodied them, some diagnosed them. Together, they reveal a society in which the central emotional question wasn't simply what happened, but what shall we make of what happened? And that question never found a shared answer. That's why Weimar literature about war and defeat remains so powerful. It's not one memorial voice speaking for the dead. It's a struggle over interpretation, a struggle as to whether damage should produce pity, rage, hardness, irony, nostalgia, a longing for authoritarian leadership, or democratic sobriety. The arts beyond literature show the same fight. Think of Otto Dix, whose paintings of mutilated veterans, prostitutes, and war cripples insist that the war remains present in the body of the Republic. Think of George Grosz, whose Germany's full of fat, corruption, cruelty, militarized stupidity, and public rot. Think of theatres and the cabarets always circling back to uniforms and amputations and humiliations and the residue of wartime values. The war's influence wasn't just confined to books about soldiers, it altered the atmosphere of the whole culture. And that's what I mean by a broken generation. Not a single age group, not a sociological slogan, but a condition. Men and women living in a society that has lost confidence in the stories it used to tell about itself. It's not yet found the replacements that are both honest and bearable. Some mourned, some satirized, some hardened, some escaped into style, and some just told the truth as coldly as they could. And the Republic had to live with them all. And that's why this second group's so important. Without it, Weimar can start to look too decorative, too urban, too knowing. The war writers and the writers of the collapse restore that vital aspect, the wound. They remind us that beneath the bright surface, the dancing, the music, the cabarets, lay millions of people who hadn't recovered and perhaps were not recoverable into the kind of moderate, patient democracy the Republic hoped to be. The city gave Weimar its nerves, the war gave it its damage. And these writers made sure that damage couldn't be entirely hidden under lights, fashion, wit, and smart political theory. Thanks very much. Subscribe for more.